In this video, we will be discussing the origins of the transatlantic slave trade, the nations involved, how it ended, and more. Up until the 14th century, voyages across the Atlantic proved difficult for Europeans due to tidal currents. However, during the 1400s and 1500s, advances in sailing technology offered greater maneuverability and, in the caravels case, the ability to sail against the wind. Europeans could now make contact with civilizations they had never seen before. This marked the beginning of the Age of Discovery. During this time period, Europeans also visited West Africa. By the time they had arrived, slavery in Africa had existed for centuries. Europe began a slave trade with Africa while also colonizing the New World. Initially, the Spanish and Portuguese Empire were the main European nations involved in the slave trade. They both had established colonies around the same time Africans started becoming enslaved outside of Africa. Spain colonized the New World, and Portugal colonized the Canary, Cape Verde, the Azores Islands, and Brazil. The Portuguese Empire was directly involved in the buying and selling of slaves, while the Spanish Empire sold licenses that permitted slave trade to merchants. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain sent the Spanish Armada to England to force them into Catholicism. The Armada lost to England in a naval battle, starting the British Navy's rise to power. Due to the fall of Spanish dominance at sea, the English, Dutch, and French replaced them as the main traders in the slave market. By 1690, England was involved in the majority of West African slave trades. Throughout the 18th century, they shipped the most slaves across the Atlantic. The Dutch used slaves to support its colonies in Suriname and the Antilles, while France used slavery to support its colonies in the Americas and Caribbean. Although the Dutch, English, and French traded most of the slaves after the fall of the Armada, Portugal also sent slaves to Brazil. Indeed, across the centuries of the Atlantic slave trade, Brazil was the destination of 40% of all slaves making the crossing from West Africa. The slave trade across the Atlantic was part of a triangle. The first side of the triangle was the trade between Europe and Africa. In exchange for textiles, rum, and other manufactured goods, African leaders would transfer slaves to European colonies in the second side of the triangle. Such slaves were usually prisoners of war from other African tribes. The journey from Africa to European colonies in the New World was called the Middle Passage. In the New World, or the Americas, the slaves that had arrived harvested sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which, as the third side of the triangle, were sent to Europe. Conditions during shipment across the Atlantic from West Africa led to the deaths of 1 in 8 slaves and 1 in 5 sailors. 350 to 600 slaves would be packed onto a single ship by slave traders. As a result of such cramped conditions, diseases such as measles, smallpox, and influenza were easily spread among slaves and sailors. Some of the deaths were also caused by suicides. Slaves would jump overboard or starve themselves, although some were force-fed. In the 18th century, a voyage through the Middle Passage would take about 2.5 months. In 1785, Englishman Thomas Clarkson wrote an influential essay speaking out against the slave trade. He would go on to make it his life's mission to educate the public of the horrors of the slave trade and become a powerful force in its abolition. Due to the movement caused by Clarkson's work, the British slave trade ended in 1807 when the English Parliament passed the Abolition of Slave Trade Act. The act prohibited slaves from being traded by Britain and her colonies. This act, due to Britain's power, had a large influence on surrounding nations. The following year, America agreed to withdraw from the transatlantic slave trade. In 1814, France signed the Treaty of Paris that said they would abolish the slave trade in 5 years. In the same year, the Netherlands agreed to stop the slave trade, and 3 years later, Spain agreed to abolish the trade by 1820. However, it wasn't until 1859 that the transatlantic slave trade was finally suppressed. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.